recording, and I'd like to welcome everybody and say good morning. This is the third of 3 sessions we have had in a series for our First Amendment workshop as part of our First Amendment Days celebration here at Iowa State University. This is our 19th year of celebrating the 5 freedoms. My name is Julie Roosa, and I have the privilege of serving as the First Amendment specialist at Iowa State. And so part of my job is to work with the committee to coordinate our First Amendment Days schedule and our theme. The other part of my job is to educate about the 5 freedoms. And so I need to take a minute here, as I have in each one of these sessions and in all the introductions I do, I need to take a minute and tell you all what those 5 freedoms are. They are the freedom of speech, press, petition, religion, and assembly. And those are in no particular order, but those are the order in which I often remember them. And we just talked in our last session about how frequent it is that we as Americans don't know what those 5 freedoms are. So now you know, and now you will remember. Today we are here to talk about making free speech an ally on campus. And we have with us to help lead through this discussion 2 preeminent experts in the field of the First Amendment. We really are fortunate here today to have joining me, first of all, Dr. Nadine Strossen, who is Professor Emerita at New York Law School. She's the past president of the American Civil Liberties Union. She is a frequent speaker and a media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties. I have to jump in here and say as well, when you talk about frequent speaker, we mean frequent, and maybe she'll share with us a little bit of what her schedule has been like. But she has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. She's the author of a book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship, which, by the way, was the source of our keynote on Wednesday night when we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Strossen share with us some thoughts about why we should support free speech on campus. So welcome, Dr. Strossen. Also, alongside of Dr. Strossen, we have Gene Policinski, who is a senior fellow for the Freedom Forum. He was one of the founding editors of USA Today and is a longtime proponent of diversity as an essential element of the free press. He's a veteran multimedia journalist and certainly, as I mentioned before, one of the preeminent experts in the area of the First Amendment. So welcome to you both. We are so fortunate to have you here. For our audience here joining us, I want to encourage you to use the chat feature of Zoom in order to interact with our 2 experts. I'll get us started with questions, but we want to make sure we're answering your questions as well. So welcome, Gene and Nadine. Here's my first question. The title of our session is Making Free Speech an Ally on Campus, which I think sort of begs the question of whether free speech isn't an ally as we speak here. So do you believe that the perception is free speech is an enemy on campus? And if so, why is that? And Dr. Strossen, we'll start with you.
Oh, please call me Nadine. And JD doesn't make me a doctor. It only takes 3 years to earn it. So I haven't earned that august title. But as a friendly Midwesterner by origin, myself, Gene, I'm from Minnesota. Please, let's be on a first name basis. I am absolutely convinced through long-standing personal experience as well as comparing notes with other human rights activists on campuses and other venues around this country and around the world, that free speech is an essential and time-tested ally, not only for the core work of a campus, namely research and studying and teaching, but also for the very important associated opportunities for campus activism, which fortunately, from my perspective, has really seen a resurgence lately. In looking forward for almost 2 years to coming to your campus, because Julie kindly invited me way back in November of 2019. I have been following many incidents of activism on your campus, and none of that, the protests, the petitions, the advocacy, the demonstrations, none of that could have taken place without a very strong free speech protection, which essentially didn't exist for students in a meaningful sense until a certain historic case from your very own state of Iowa in 1969, in which I'm proud to say the ACLU represented Mary Beth and John Tinker and others in persuading the Supreme Court to say it was talking about even younger students, but it certainly applies to campus as well. Freedom of speech does not stop at the schoolhouse gate or the university gate. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that, Julie, because you're absolutely correct that too many students and others, especially those who are crusading for social justice causes, too often don't see free speech as their ally.
As you might expect, I can only follow up humbly behind Nadine, who was a true champion of the First Amendment. But one of the things that seems to be challenging the idea today with campus activists and others, in some cases, is the idea that some idea is either too dangerous to be heard, or that somehow one should not be exposed to those ideas because they are a root sort of challenge to one's standing, or even might convince the unknowing to go down the bad path. And I think one of the things to keep in mind when we talk about free speech, truly, as to me, as Nadine said so well, the sort of essence of a university to me, what other better time in life to be able to consider everything and speak out about everything and consider everything, is engagement is not endorsement. Conversation is not acceptance. It is a manner in which we really hold true to what the founders had in mind, which is that when we're confronted with problems, the best way for us to work on them is to talk to each other, and do so without government interference or putting its thumb on the scale. And at a university, again, the very purpose to me of a university is to explore, to posit a theory and then prove or disprove that theory. You can phrase it in any number of ways, but whenever I see a university or groups within a university saying, silence this person, or don't allow this speaker, or don't, we can't possibly hear from that person, or this position has no validity, therefore it has no room in the marketplace of ideas. To me, it's the antithetical aspect of what a university ought to be about. So I think it's a tremendous ally. It's also, to me, very much, again, what the academic process is all about, is learning, positing theories, proving and disproving things, moving through in an educated way to some kind of conclusion. That to me requires free speech. So again, I see it as to me, permeating every aspect of a university.
Absolutely. I think that so often the First Amendment can be vilified as something that is a negative, when in reality, when we look at the bigger picture and step back, it is so essential to the work that we do in higher education. For my next question, I'm going to sort of involve our audience here. And for my students who are joining me today, you know how I like to use these polls in class. So I want to, first of all, take the pulse of the audience on a question and then turn it around and ask our experts to weigh in. So if you have access to your keyboard, I will be launching a poll, and you should be able to click yes, no, I don't know, or other. But what I want to do, I want to pull from a case that was in the headlines here recently involving a student at a university who was disciplined for her social media posts, which were posted off campus, but the university believed reflected poorly on sort of them as an institution. So do you believe, audience, that a public institution should be able to discipline a student for social media posts that, have an implication to the university itself. So in other words, I'm not asking just in general, but when the content of the post somehow implicates the university itself and maybe affects its credibility, do you believe the university ought to be able to take action? And we're talking about a public university here. So I'm going to launch my poll. You'll see it in front of you, and this is anonymous, so we won't know how you answer. But do you believe the university ought to be able to have the power to discipline a student in this case? We'll let the poll work here. I can watch as the progress is made in those of you who are able to respond. And we'll let it work here just for another second or two.
Julie, may I ask a question about how this works? Do people who are answering, do they see how other people are answering?
No, they don't, but I can show the results.
But no, that's good, because I wanted to make sure they were voting independently of what others, how others are answering.
Right. Yes. We have 34 now. We're at 87% of those who are eligible to vote have now voted. And I do like to remind myself, sometimes students don't have, and others don't have access to the ability to vote. So I try not to put too much pressure on, but please, I'll give another second or two for you to share your perspective on the power of a university to discipline its students for social media posts. Again, I want to clarify social media posts that, at least in theory, reflect upon the university itself. All right, we are at a pretty good response rate here. I think I will end the poll now, and I'll turn it around, share those results. You'll see here that 25% agree, yes, the university ought to be able to have that option. No, 64% saying no, the university should not discipline one of its students for social media posts made. 8% not sure or don't know, and then 3% voted other. So I'm going to stop sharing the poll now. I think always when I use these polls, Nadine and Gene, in my class, it's always interesting to me because it really shows that there are arguments on both sides and opinions on both sides. So this is based on an actual situation involving a university that did in fact discipline, I think it was a graduate student, for some social media posts that the university felt was in poor taste. Ultimately, I think reversed their course of action with the discipline. But you can see here from the results that the opinions are on both sides. So please weigh in on your thoughts on, especially in light of thinking about free speech as an ally on campus.
This is a very important issue. I've seen many examples of universities disciplining not only undergraduates, but also graduate and professional students, and also faculty members. And if I may say, there is an analogy to other public employees, police officers and firefighters and other public servants. And I'll be devil's advocate for the position I ultimately disagree with, but there is a plausible argument that you are a servant of the public, you're perceived that way, or you're a representative of this university. If you're a graduate student or in a professional school, and some of these cases have involved medical students, dental students, pharmacist students, law students, you're reflecting poorly on the profession, you're acting in an unprofessional way. Those are not implausible arguments. But, and here's a phrase that lawyers often use, that proves too much. If anything that any of us said on social media, on our own time, from our own devices, having nothing directly to do with our professional positions or our student positions or our employee positions, if anything would be fair game, because of the plausible argument that it might be taken to reflect negatively on the institution, we'd have no free speech rights left at all. There is an important case before the Supreme Court right now, an ACLU case following in the steps of Tinker. And we've asked the Supreme Court to hear many such cases over many years. I'm glad that it finally has agreed to do so. It happens to involve a high school cheerleader whose social media posts included four-letter words and vulgarities and were said to reflect poorly on the school. She was disciplined, including being taken off the cheerleading squad. And interestingly enough, the lower court drew an absolute categorical bright line rule, which said never, ever may a school discipline a student for any off-campus speech that was not using school time or school resources. I happen to think that was a correct decision, but it's certainly not yet established as the First Amendment law of the land. We'll see.
Yeah, there's disagreement in the circuits about how far you can extend those things on, even on campus or off campus. Can you go out into the parking lot for something that's said or done in outside the school after hours, for example? I go at the analysis, again, agreeing with Nadine completely, but my analysis would be, what would be the goal be in the discipline? If there's a call for it, it's to express displeasure on behalf of some people with what was said. But for the school, it is, as Nadine touched on, to demonstrate that the school is not, let's pick, these are often comments around race or gender these days, or even COVID-19. The school's position on those, to make clear what that school position is. For example, if it's a racist comment, to say we oppose racism, therefore we're going to penalize this person for demonstrating these values as associated with us. And again, I often come to the conclusion that that's taking a shortcut through the First Amendment to solve another problem. If your university has demonstrated commitment to racial equality, the fact that a student speaks out on it ought not to be the trigger for you to leap into full defensive mode and punish that person as a way of demonstrating. Do the work. Be against racism in advance, so that when this person's comments come out, you can logically say, well, that doesn't represent our university, which is deeply involved in racial equity and inclusion and justice. So many times, particularly recently, but maybe always, people want to take a shortcut through free speech or a shortcut through the First Amendment to solve a larger social issue. And it comes under if we don't permit them to say it, that problem will go away. Or if we don't permit a student or a professor to post, therefore our institution won't be implicated. And it's a defensive posture that, again, take the easiest route, if you will, through the First Amendment. Let's just silence them. Let's just punish them for what they've had to say. Far better to me to do that proverbial teaching moment around that post. And in that, if you have done the work in advance that you say you support, you can point to your university or your institution, your company's posture, and say, this clearly doesn't represent our values. They have a right to say it, but we have done X, Y, Z, and we stand for X, Y, Z. I think the biggest fear that often provokes these punishments is we haven't done the work, or in fact, we have worked counter to it. And therefore we need to take this dramatic step to dramatize and maybe defend ourselves against what, frankly, if in the final analysis might be legitimate criticism. So I start with that analysis and work backward.
And that's a great analysis. And if I can say, I think that Iowa State University, from what I've seen, has done exactly that in just a fantastically effective and eloquent way, which I'm going to be quoting on other campuses. There was a student petition with a lot of demands for punitive action against people who had engaged in hateful speech. And I read, among other things, a really, respectful but forceful response, which was signed by the first signatory was Sharon Evans, the Associate Vice President for Student Affairs and Dean of Students. It was also signed by the University Council and others, including Toya Younger, with whom I had the opportunity to meet a couple of days ago. And they took an absolute opposition to any suggestion that there would be any punishment of people who had engaged in hateful speech, but constantly stressed how completely inconsistent with the university values those statements were, and really stressed an educational response. Gene, coming back to your wonderful statements about, this is the essence of the university. We don't approach even the speech that we disagree with and think is dangerous and wrong. We take an educational approach to that rather than a punitive approach. And then it also offered a specific set of resources for the students who were harmed and upset by the speech. So I thought it was so respectful of not only free speech, but also all of the values that are assailed by the hateful speech without giving up on the hateful speakers, trying to fold that person into the educational process.
And, again, accepting the fact that people say it is not approving of what they say. It is simply accepting they have a right to say it. I think it was Justice Jackson in the late 40s in an opinion in the U.S. Supreme Court who said that we need to be exposed to speech that we find even repellent and repugnant, if only at times to be better prepared to argue against it. And I think that's often lost in some of these punitive aspects is, they can often be a spur where they capture public's attention at the moment. And that is of concern. Oh my gosh, that the person's captured the headlines and they're in the news and that's going to have our university's name next to it. That's an opportunity really when people are paying attention to say, no, these are the values we prize. And as Nadine, I quoted from that wonderful letter, these are the things we prize. And in fact, here are the tools we have to advance those and respond. So, again, thankfully, there's an old term, I think it's associated with religion and music, called call and response. And I think sometimes we forget that nature of the First Amendment. It is not for someone to say something to then be judged or even be effective. It's a call and response exchange. And we need to keep that in mind when we look at these things, not to dismiss the harm, the hurt. I think, again, Justice Roberts in the Westboro Baptist case said, there was an acknowledgement that what that church or group was saying was hurtful, particularly in that case to the parents of a Marine who had died. But our commitment for free speech was so strong that we can't silence the speaker. That we have to hear those things and then be motivated, in essence, echoing Justice Jackson, be motivated to take action as a result. And that action to me, again, is not punitive to me, it is responsive.
Very good. I do see we have a question in the chat, but before we get to that, I want to launch one more poll here. Take the pulse of the audience again, this time bringing it a little more, my question a little closer to home. So an issue came up after the election right here at Iowa State involving a tweet that was shared on social media by one of our student organizations. And some on campus interpreted the tweet to be inciting violence. It said something to the effect of everyone should arm up. The elites are going to get it. So I want to, in this poll, ask the audience if you believe that in that situation where we have a student organization posting that kind of a statement out in the world, if you think in that situation the university should take action. So again, should the student group be punished for a tweet that said, I think to the effect, and Nadine, I don't know if you have it in your files, the
I probably do.
I don't have them in front of me, but I'm pretty sure, and maybe some of my students know and can put in the chat for me exactly what the words were. But we're talking about a situation with a student organization posting in social media comments that some interpreted to be a threat. Do you think the university should take action against that student group? Yes, no, don't know, or other. And hopefully I'm doing justice to kind of summarizing the situation.
I recall reading about that. So
yeah, it got a lot of nationwide publicity.
and I don't mean to put anyone on the spot. I think that we get,
Well, here's the statement
Okay.
from the college Republicans at Iowa State. Everyone, you must arm up. Expect these people to attempt to destroy your life. The elites want revenge on us.
okay, thank you. Thank you. So hopefully that doesn't change your response to our poll. And again, everybody, this poll just asks your opinion on, what action should be taken. It is anonymous, so we won't know how you vote, but we do want to know how you are thinking when it comes to these very real issues that directly involve the First Amendment. So should the university take action against the group that posted the phrase there? I'll give
An action against, I assume, doesn't mean an educational call and response, to quote Gene.
Yeah.
Yes. Good point. Yes.
Yeah, some kind of punitive measure.
Yes.
Okay.
So let me give you just another couple of seconds here to gather your thoughts and vote in the poll if you are able. Should the university take punitive action in this case? All right, we have about 82% who have voted. And again, I know that not everyone is able to vote, even though you might like to vote. You can always vote in the chat, although then we'll know kind of how you're feeling. But again, these issues that come up have arguments on both sides, and there are opinions on both sides. So it's not to minimize those opinions. It's just for us to talk about those. So let me stop my poll here. Again, I will share the results and hopefully you all can see what we have. It looks like 69% of those who voted said yes, the university should take punitive action, 13% no, another 13% don't know, and 6% maybe have other ideas that we can hopefully get into. So I'm gonna stop sharing and turn it over to our experts for your reaction.
Do you want to go first this time, Gene?
Sure. Well, if nothing else, I'll try to be consistent. No. Now, this is a more complicated circumstance in that when we talk about, and I suspect what's driving people is this idea of arm up so that it's a potential threat. But there's something, and again, it gets a little more, and Nadine will, I know, do a better job of explaining this, but the true threat doctrine, to be a criminal act, you've got to have certain elements. It has to be directed at a specific target, in effect, usually a person, of course, maybe a small group, that could be. It needs to be something that is immediate, that produces the immediate response. So that my example is often, if I'm speaking, let's say on a college campus, and I'll use my background, my parents are of Polish and Irish extent. If I can give a hateful speech, and if I were to say, we need to arm up against those Irish, Polish people because they're terrible, they're ignorant, they steal our jobs, they smell, whatever it says, and that's pretty hateful. But I'm entirely protected, I believe, by the First Amendment in that, because I'm expressing that view. When I say let's arm up because they're a threat and they're coming for us, I would think that you're still protected. And frankly, I would say you should be protected, because at that point, you're still talking about a general concept. Where I cross the line, to cut short my lunch speech, is when I say, and there's one now, go get him. At that point, I have moved to conduct, not concept. And I have crossed the line into unprotected speech. So would I favor this statement? No. Do I think it's not valuable, not contributory to debate? A whole bunch of criticisms I might have of this. Do I think it's protected? Yes, I do. So I would respectfully disagree with the now 69%. I think I've managed to bump up the people who disagree with me by 1 point. So Nadine, over to you to save the First Amendment point, perhaps.
From a First Amendment law perspective, this is an easy question. If there were an attempt by a public university, including Iowa State, which is bound by the First Amendment, an attempt to punish the speech, I have no doubt that all 9 justices on the Supreme Court would agree that that would be unconstitutional. And I want to stress that, because we have a Supreme Court that is very fractured on many constitutional issues, including many free speech issues. But on this kind of issue, from the extreme right to the extreme left on the court, they are consistent that government may only punish speech because in general, that it's posing an emergency. and that can't be prevented in any way other than silencing the speech. Gene talked about one type of speech that satisfies that emergency standard, namely what we lawyers call a true threat. You know, not the way we loosely use the word threat. I feel threatened by that statement. That's not enough. As Gene explained, the speaker has to intend to instill a reasonable fear on the part of a specific targeted audience that they are going to be subject to harm. And another good example that's been in the news a lot lately, for understandable reasons, is intentional incitement to imminent violence, where the speaker intends to instill imminent violence or lawlessness, and imminent violence or lawlessness is likely to happen. What is completely protected is anything short of that, even, and the Supreme Court has expressly said, even advocacy of violence or lawlessness is protected as long as it's not intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently. The court has also stressed that in the passion and fury of debate and advocacy on public issues that we feel strongly about, we're often going to engage in rhetorical hyperbole. So imagine that there's somebody who is completely upset and distraught, as I am, about the latest video of unjustified police assassination of an unarmed young Black person. Suppose, there's a spontaneous demonstration about that. And now I'm paraphrasing. Everybody says, everyone, arm up. You've got to expect these people, meaning the police officers, to attempt to destroy your life. These police officers, they want revenge on us. The exact same language. And I have no doubt that there would be attempts to punish it from those who disagree with the message, right? And that's exactly what you're not allowed to do. You may not punish speech solely because of disagreement, even the strongest disagreement with the message. It's only when it crosses the line to posing an actual threat or intentional incitement of imminent violence. And there are a number of cases in the Supreme Court that have very strong language that the court has protected. One was from a leader of the NAACP who was infuriated about racial discrimination and was organizing a boycott of Southern merchants, white merchants who engaged in racial discrimination. And he's saying, if any of you breaks, and please forgive me, I use four-letter words, if anybody of you breaks that damn boycott, I'm going to break your neck. We're going to break your legs. And there actually was some violence against people who broke the boycott, but the Supreme Court said, it wasn't tightly and directly, imminently connected to the speaker. They couldn't show that the speaker really intended it. It was a figure of speech. It was hyperbole, which we have to give license to if we're going to have unfettered debate about these incredibly important public issues.
Julie, you're muted.
Thank you for that clarification. I want to go back and grab Andrea's question, sort of broadening our discussion out to private universities as well. So we know that the First Amendment restrains the government from taking action, and that means public institutions. But with private institutions, the rules are a little bit different. And Andrea's asking, how can we advocate, especially when, for example, a board of trustees might not actually want students to exercise their First Amendment rights? How can we, the collective, we advocate, and what can we do in those situations?
Gene, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think the first thing is, again, a necessity if you can find a time when we're not at a flashpoint. Very often the trustees will react, in my experience, to a certain incident or flashpoint, and they make a policy that even they later regret. So I think it's getting private universities, which are not governed by the First Amendment. The First Amendment restrains only government from silencing us and the rest of the freedoms. So try to, in my view, would be try to have them adopt a statement, a policy in which essentially they agree to adhere to First Amendment principles. Institutions can bind themselves by their own policies, but I always joke the worst time to develop ethics is when you need them. The worst time to develop a First Amendment protection policy is when you need it. So that hopefully there will be a moment when there is not a flashpoint incident. And then I think, again, you raise the points that we've talked about, where, it's at the heart of university to permit these things. I think it was at University of Chicago, talking about trigger warnings, the president there wrote a wonderful letter about it, that has some aspects that maybe we would all challenge, but essentially was saying, here are our values. Here's what we're going to stand for. We're going to bind ourselves by those. And I think that's the way private institutions need to build in these guarantees, so that when flashpoints do come, it's both a safety net for the university to point to, but also a shield for those exercising their First Amendment rights.
Those are great points. And putting on my law professor hat, I want to add to the really important point Gene made, that which most people are unaware of, that the First Amendment only protects them against violations of free speech by the government. And so a private university, not being a government actor, is not bound by the First Amendment, but it does have other legal constraints under contract law. And the vast majority of private universities, with very few exceptions, which are mostly for religious schools or military schools with a very precise purpose, the vast majority of private universities espouse the very same principles of academic freedom and free speech as would be constitutionally mandated for public universities. They do it for pedagogical reasons. That this is consistent with their mission as research and teaching and learning institutions. And the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, has had many successful lawsuits against private universities for violating free speech rights of students and faculty members on a contractual theory. They look at the website and the handbooks that promise fidelity to academic freedom, and the argument is accepted that I wouldn't have accepted a job here, I wouldn't have enrolled as a student here, except that I was relying on these promises, and the court then enforces those.
Nadine, it's such a great point. And again, in the proactive sense, I think there's ample evidence that universities can actually use those statements to recruit a higher caliber of student, or a student that they wish, the kind of students they hope to recruit. So that, again, trying to put yourself in the position of a development officer or a president, these can be assets for the university, both as a clear statement of purpose before there's a controversy and as recruitment tools to say, these are the values our university prizes. And again, not so naive as not to recognize some people will say, that opens the door to this and that. But I think on balance, universities need to recruit students. They need to recruit the best possible students. And there's even some studies which show that students who are given those freedoms by a private university, or that's not the right word, enjoy those freedoms by virtue of a declaration by a private university. Actually, those students do better, that they accomplish more because they are afforded those opportunities to practice those freedoms that they're going to enjoy in the rest of their life. Why should they be excluded from those in that slice of time when you're engaged with an academic institution? It better prepares your students for the real world. So I think there's recruitment and positive aspects for someone at a private university to go to those officials and say, these are reasons we should have these things, both defensively, speaking from watching people defend themselves, but also from a proactive recruitment and campus environment nature. The rules are out there. Let's say it that way.
Very good. Very good. I think the students will like to hear that, those who are with us today, that you're a higher caliber student for being here, engaging in these conversations. And we're hopeful that you carry forward some of this advocacy that Gene and Nadine are talking about. I have one more poll I want to throw at you, and I'm going to bring in Abby's question to some extent to the poll question I want to ask you. But so first I want to ask, switching gears to the right to assemble and petition. There was an instance at a university where students gathered in the administration building to make their views known, and they were citing their freedom to assemble and to petition. They gathered peacefully, but at some point the university, I guess to be blunt, grew weary of their presence in the building. My understanding is the students were not disrupting the business that was happening in the administrative building, but they were asked to leave. They chose not to, and they were disciplined. So my poll question for my audience here is, when it comes to assembly and gathering at a university in one of the administration buildings, so we could think about Beercher Hall for those students who are from Iowa State, and I'm sure BV has a similar building. Do you believe that the university should be able to discipline the students for not leaving when asked to leave? So we're talking about assembling in an administrative building to let your views be known. You're doing so peacefully, but the university has asked you to leave. Do you believe, and when you don't, then you are disciplined. Do you believe the university, public university, should have that ability? We'll let the poll work here, and then I'm going to fold in Abby's question as sort of a next level about current, some of the current issues we're seeing with protests and curfews. So do you believe the university, public university, ought to be able to take action against students who have gathered to petition in one of the administrative buildings? Yes, no, don't know, or other. Again, this is based on your opinion, so there are arguments on both sides, and we're just curious to get the pulse of what you are thinking on this issue. Do you believe the university should take action? Should be able to take action? Get a few of you, a few more votes in here, and we'll see. Then I'll share with the audience. All right, I think I'll go ahead and end the poll just in the interest of time. Here are our results. 30% yes, the university ought to be able to take action and discipline students. 60% no, 10% don't know, and that was our results. So I'm going to stop sharing. Again, kick it over to our experts here. Talk to us about the right to assemble and how that works when the university also has an interest in conducting its business.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the polling, and I wish I could speak to one or more or hear from one or more respondents who said there is a free speech right in this context, which was the majority of the respondents, but there was not a free speech right in the last polling question, because the legal answers are flip-flop. Now, stressing, Julie, that the devil is in the details. You did say that the demonstration was non-disruptive. Of course, if it was disruptive in any way of the administration, the orderly course of business in that building, that would be subject to punishment. But the case law would indicate even without disruption, there is no obligation on the part of the university to open a building to free expression, either by individuals or by groups. And I get to teach a little bit of First Amendment law here. The Supreme Court has said that certain government property on a university campus, that would include the sidewalks, the malls, the plazas, the streets, those are what are called traditional public forums, which are open to free speech, including assemblies, subject only to what we call content neutral time, place, and manner regulations. But once you get beyond those traditional public forums, it's completely up to the government, in this case, the university, to decide whether or not it is going to designate any other property, including an administration building, as either a so-called designated or limited public forum that is open at least to certain speakers on certain topics. And you didn't say this in your hypothetical, Julie, but I assume assume the university did not designate its administration building as a limited public forum for free speech, which would mean that its only obligation is that the limitations have to be reasonable, which is a very low standard to satisfy basically anything that's not unreasonable. It doesn't have to show that it's actually disruptive. It can just show that it's inconvenient. And it also, this is really important, has to be viewpoint neutral. So if there was any evidence that the real reason that the university wanted to kick out those protesters was because of disagreement with their message, that would be subject to a constitutional challenge. But if they were even-handedly saying, we don't care if you're saying, you know, we love you, administration, or we hate you, administration, we don't want you in here because you're making it harder for us to do our business, that would be permissible under the First Amendment.
Yeah, Nadine, as usual, nailed the analysis. You know, there is an aspect the Supreme Court has recognized that free speech or an assembly, when powering that, the drive for petition, is inherently disruptive. And you can't be penalized for being irritating, essentially, or even, as you said, on a public forum, say blocking temporarily a sidewalk or a street in the manner of you know, again, not violating time, place, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. But the court has acknowledged that. But I think exactly as Nadine said, you know, that specific venue, particularly given the alternatives on a college campus, again, to put it down to sort of, you know, the practicality of it, by not allowing one to protest in that building does not mean you may not protest. It does not mean your voice may not be heard. You know, drop back to the larger First Amendment analysis. You may still make your points in a manner likely to attract public attention. You know, you can't, and as I think actually at one point did Iowa State have a free speech zone somewhere out? Usually it's out behind the boiler plant, 22 miles from the center of campus. You know, that's the free speech zone. But, and I think that was the subject of some either litigation or discussion previously. So again, it cannot be unreasonable, but again, you know, we have to live together. We don't live in caves. The First Amendment is, I like to say, is as absolute as we want it to be. We have to get along. A speech I can deliver in the heart of that campus in the open quad area at noon with a little loudspeaker is permissible. And again, can't be restrained because of what I'm saying or because somebody disagrees with it. At 3 a.m. under your dorm window, I can deliver that same exact speech, same volume, same words, and that might be not permitted because you have a right in your dorm room to a certain degree of privacy and reasonable use, presumably sleep at that hour. Although I think I was in college, it may not be 3 a.m. But there are those considerations. So we're looking at concept, but also the practical implementation of how do we live together, respecting First Amendment freedoms without abusing other people's rights. And so it's always in First Amendment cases, and as you said so eloquently, the devil is in those details of balancing those issues very often. But here I think, again, she's absolutely right on the analysis that it is exactly what would happen if this were to go to a court.
Excellent. So I want to be mindful of the time, but I also know that many in the audience want to hear an answer to Abby's question, kind of extending this discussion to what we're seeing with the protests and the curfews. And in this case, we are talking about a traditional public forum on the public streets. So for those who need to sign off, I say thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. For those who can stick around just for a few more minutes, I'd like to ask your indulgence in allowing our experts to weigh in on what we're watching unfold here within this last week. So what about those curfews?
Oh, in the cities, yeah. Nadine?
Can you tell me what it is? Because again, the devil is in the details.
Sure. So Abby's question is, multiple cities recently put a 7 p.m. curfew into effect in response to planned protests. These protests were very publicly planned and not planned for violence. Does this not infringe our First Amendment right to assemble? How do we fight this violation?
Based on that factual statement, it certainly strikes me as a free speech violation for a number of reasons. One of which is that this is a classic so-called prior restraint, which has historically and to this day been seen as one of the gravest violations of free speech, stopping the expression before it can occur. 7 p.m. also strikes me as not a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. Going back to one of Gene's examples, if you said you can't do it, after midnight or 10 p.m. when most people are seeking peace and quiet to sleep, that would be something else. But this seems to be so extreme that it has this suspicious indicia of really being a pretext to silence particular messages. And at the very least, the government would have the burden of proof to show that there was some specific danger to public safety, and that for some reason the police were not able to protect the public safety. That is their first responsibility. They are sworn or take affirmations to uphold the law, which includes the Constitution and the First Amendment. That if a speaker might engage in violence or provoke violence, the answer is not to suppress the speaker, it's to prevent the violence, protect others who might be subject to the violence. Otherwise, we have what the Supreme Court has called a heckler's veto. You can't hold the speaker hostage to somebody else's threatened violence. So I would say this is constitutionally suspect, and I assume my colleagues in the ACLU, as they've had to do so many times in the recent past, are bringing lawsuits. And this is a really important lesson for everybody here. The First Amendment, along with the rest of the Constitution, is not self-executing. It's not self-enforcing. Same thing is true for the Equal Protection Clause, all of those other wonderful rights that James Madison, who was the chief author, said these are mere parchment barriers against government abuse. And for most of our nation's history, most of them were completely unenforced. So it takes individuals who know what their rights are. This is where all of you come in to stand up and protest and defend yourselves, and get the aid of lawyers, including those in the ACLU. To the best of my knowledge, we have won every single lawsuit that we've brought on behalf of journalists who have been imprisoned and subjected to violence, to peaceful demonstrators, to legal observers. It takes a lot of work, and we've won. So, based on what I say, there's a winning lawsuit here.
Well, Nadine, I took 7 p.m. unreasonable and demonstrate immediate threat of violence. That was my 2 quick notes. Again, this is illustrative of a larger challenge to First Amendment rights, to build on Nadine's point. When you look at city councils that say you can speak, but only between for 2 minutes, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and you have to notify us 3 weeks ahead of time of what you're going to be doing. That to me is the same sort of unreasonable restriction. And it's an attempt to silence speech. It has an ulterior motive. They always say it's to preserve order, or that meetings can't go on forever. You know what? My answer to public officials, having sat through some 12-hour budget hearings when I was a young reporter, is, if you have to stay there late in the night, that's your job, to hear people. It is not to run a 2-hour meeting and squeeze all the debate into that 2 hours. Likewise, if, as Nadine mentioned, if it's difficult to enforce public safety, well, then that's your problem as a public official. Then you need more resources to do that. You need to draw lines between the groups. So there are tactics in which you can do, short of silencing that speech. The First Amendment has to be protected by the people whose duty it is to protect it. It can't be, again, sort of, oh, we'd like to do that, but we're busy, we're tired, it's going to cost money. That is the nature of our society, that we will expend those resources and that time and that effort to defend those core freedoms. And they ought not to be sacrificed early on because it's hard, difficult, and the potential for violence. Again, you probably could enforce that 7 p.m. curfew if at 4 a.m. buildings are on fire. But in advance, not so justifiable. 2 weeks later, when there has been no intervening period of violence, I don't think a court is going to say, oh, that's a reasonable restriction. So again, it is to some degree dependent on the facts. But remember, we don't go into those arguments with the government having a position here and us having, let's say, free speakers having a position here, and the government gets, the judge gets to decide. We go in with all of our rights, and there's only a very narrow window on which the government may restrain them for very immediate short-term reasons. They have to demonstrate an absolute need. There are these conditions we set on that narrow, tiny little slice of rights they get to intrude on. And I think sometimes these curfews are as if, it's in my power to shut down the city when I want to because it might be easier. No, you can't do that unless you can justify it, and it has to be for the shortest term possible for a clearly identifiable need like public safety. It can't be to sort of make everybody feel okay and whatever. And I think sometimes that's the motivation that seems to be behind these kind of 7 p.m. or 5 p.m. curfews.
Well, thank you to you both. I wish we had more time. I'm betting the audience does as well. I think I want to end with these two wise pieces of advice from our discussion today. From Gene, avoid shortcutting through the First Amendment, right? In terms of how can we make free speech an ally on our campus? Let's avoid dodging the real issues that underlie so much of this. And from Nadine, remember that the First Amendment is not self-executing. We all have an obligation to advocate and to act. So thank you to you both for this really enlightening session. Thank you to Andrea and to Brian Steffen for the 2 sessions prior, which also were just so valuable. I appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you to the audience too for joining us. There is one more session in our First Amendment Days events here this afternoon with Mary Beth Tinker, I might add, who Nadine mentioned, and Mary Beth Romslow, who is the director of a movie called Raise Your Voice, a documentary about the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting and the youth voice that arose from that. So join us if you are able for that enlightening panel discussion at 1 o'clock. Otherwise, my thanks to you all and have a nice afternoon, everybody.
Many thanks, everybody. I really enjoyed seeing you again, Gene. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you, Julie and Andrea. Congratulations on a wonderful week.
Likewise, Nadine, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great to meet you, Nadine. Gene, it was wonderful to see you.
Till
Good to
soon.
see you, Andrea.